The smoke still curled from the wagon wheels when Nora Ellison fell to her knees in the dirt, her pale blue dress already black with soot and ash. She had been traveling alone from Santa Fe to meet her brother in Prescott when the raiders came in the night, 3 men with bandanas over their faces who took her money pouch, her mother's silver necklace, and set fire to everything she owned before vanishing into the Arizona darkness. Now the sun beat down mercilessly on the remains of her life, and all she could think about was the photograph. "Madam, you should not be this close to the embers," a deep voice said behind her. Nora turned to see a man dismounting from a bay horse, dust rising around his worn boots as he landed. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that needed cutting, wearing a faded blue shirt and leather vest that had seen better days. A holstered revolver sat at his hip, and his brown eyes held concern as he looked at her kneeling in the ashes. "My photograph," she said, her voice hoarse from crying and smoke. "Everything else they can have, but I need that photograph." The man walked closer, his boots crunching on the scorched earth. "What kind of photograph, my parents?" Nora whispered. "It is the only one that exists. My mother died 2 years ago, my father 5 years before that. That photograph is all I have left of them together." Her hands were shaking as she reached toward a charred piece of wood, pulling it aside even though the heat still radiated from it. "I had it wrapped in oilcloth inside a wooden box." Maybe it survived. The stranger crouched beside her, and she noticed his hands were calloused and strong. "My name is James Quinn. I was riding from Chloride when I saw the smoke. Been tracking it for the past hour." He looked at the destroyed wagon, then back at her. "The box was inside the wagon." "Yes, tucked in the corner near where I kept my clothes trunk." Nora pointed to the left side of the wreckage, where blackened metal hoops still held the shape of what had been her traveling home for 2 weeks. "Please, Mr. Quinn, I know it seems foolish when everything is gone, but that photograph means more to me than anything else I owned." James studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we will find it." He stood and walked to his horse, pulling a pair of thick leather gloves from his saddlebag. "The ashes are still hot. You will burn yourself without protection." "I do not have gloves," Nora said quietly. "Use mine. I have handled worse with bare hands." He passed her the gloves, and she noticed a long scar running along his right forearm. When he saw her looking, he said, "Branding iron accident when I was 16. Taught me to be more careful." Nora pulled on the gloves, which were far too large for her slender hands, but they would work. "Thank you for stopping. Most men would have ridden past." "Most men are fools," James said simply. He knelt beside the wreckage and began carefully moving aside larger pieces of charred wood. "Tell me about the box. What did it look like?" "Pine wood, about the size of a book with brass corners. My father made it for my mother on their wedding day. She kept letters in it until she died, and then I used it for the photograph and a few other small things." Nora worked beside him, her hands trembling inside the oversized gloves as she lifted away pieces of burnt canvas and metal. The morning sun climbed higher and sweat dripped down her back, but she did not stop. They worked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds their breathing and the scrape of debris being moved aside. Then James said, "Where were you headed, Prescott?" "My brother works there as a telegraph operator. He sent word that he had found me a position teaching at the school." Nora paused, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. "I spent everything I had on the wagon and supplies for the journey. Those raiders took what little money I had left." "Teaching is good work," James said. He lifted a large section of the wagon's side panel, muscles straining under his shirt. "My sister taught in Kansas before she married. Said it was the most rewarding thing she ever did." "You are from Kansas?" Nora asked, grateful for the conversation to keep her mind off what she might not find. Born there. Came west 7 years ago when I was 19. Worked cattle drives, did some mining, learned to break horses. He set the panel aside carefully. Settled in chloride about 2 years back. It is rough country, but it suits me. Nora reached into a pile of ash and felt something solid. Her heart jumped, but when she pulled it free, it was just a melted tin cup. She set it aside with a disappointed sigh. I grew up in St. Louis. My parents moved there from Virginia before I was born. Everything was so green and alive. This desert feels like another world. It takes getting used to, James agreed. But there is beauty here if you know where to look. The sunsets are like fire across the whole sky. The mountains turn purple in the evening. And when it rains, which is not often, the whole desert blooms overnight. They continued searching, moving methodically through the ruins. The sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive. James retrieved a canteen from his horse and offered it to Nora, who drank gratefully before handing it back. "How long were you traveling alone?" he asked, taking a drink himself. 2 weeks. I left Santa Fe with a wagon train heading to California, but when we reached the split near Fort Whipple, I continued south toward Prescott while they went west. Nora's voice was bitter. The wagon master warned me not to travel alone, but I thought I would be fine. It was only supposed to be 3 more days. The raiders, did you get a look at them? Not really. It was dark and they wore bandanas. 3 men on horseback. They spoke English, not Spanish, if that helps. She pulled aside a burnt blanket and coughed at the ash that rose into the air. They took my things and rode north, I think, though I cannot be certain. James's jaw tightened. Probably drifters taking advantage of lone travelers. Happens too often out here. He moved to a new section of the wreckage, his hands blackened with soot. The law does not reach as far as it should in Arizona territory. You think they will come back? Nora asked quietly. No. They got what they wanted and will be far away by now, spending your money on whiskey and cards. He looked at her seriously. But you should not travel alone again, Miss Ellison, not in this country. I do not have much choice now, she said. Everything I owned is ash. They worked for another hour, the sun beating down without mercy. Nora's arms ached and her dress was ruined beyond repair, but she refused to give up. The photograph had to be somewhere in this mess. It had to have survived. Then James stopped moving. Miss Ellison, I think I found something. Nora scrambled over to where he knelt, her heart pounding. In his hands was a rectangular shape, blackened and partially burned, but definitely a box. The brass corners were tarnished and warped from heat, but still recognizable. That is it, she breathed. That is my mother's box. James carefully brushed away the ash coating the outside. The wood was charred on one side, but the other side looked relatively intact. The oilcloth might have protected what was inside. He looked at her. Would you like to open it, or should I? Nora reached out with trembling hands, then pulled back. I am afraid to look. What if it is destroyed? Then at least you will know, James said gently. But maybe it survived. That box protected it pretty well from the looks of things. Taking a deep breath, Nora accepted the box from his hands. It was still warm to the touch. She found the small brass latch on the front and carefully pried it open. The hinges protested but held. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what had been white oilcloth but was now brown and brittle, was a rectangular package. Nora lifted it out carefully, her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She unwrapped the oilcloth slowly, layer by layer, until finally the photograph emerged. It was intact. The edges were slightly browned and one corner had a small scorch mark, but the image was clear. Her mother and father stood together in front of a photographer's backdrop, her mother seated with her father standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder. They were both young, probably not much older than Nora was now, and they looked happy and full of hope for their future together. Nora pressed the photograph to her chest and began to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. All the fear and loss and exhaustion of the past night poured out of her, and she could not stop the tears. She felt James's hand on her shoulder, steady and comforting. He did not speak, just stayed close while she cried. When she finally raised her head, he offered her a handkerchief from his pocket. "Thank you," she managed, wiping her eyes. "I am sorry for falling apart like that." "You have nothing to apologize for," James said. "You lost everything last night except what matters most. I would say tears are more than warranted." Nora looked at the photograph again, running her finger gently over her parents' faces. "My father was a carpenter. He built beautiful furniture, pieces that people kept for generations. My mother was a seamstress, the finest in St. Louis. She could make a dress from scraps that would look better than what wealthy women wore." She smiled through her tears. "They loved each other so much. Even when my father got sick and could not work anymore, even when we had to sell almost everything we owned, they still had each other. My mother said that was all that really mattered in the end." "They sound like good people," James said. "The best." Nora carefully wrapped the photograph back in what remained of the oilcloth and tucked it into the bodice of her dress. "I will never be able to repay you for helping me find this, Mr. Quinn." "James," he corrected. "And no payment is needed. I am glad we found it." He stood and offered her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. "Now we need to figure out what to do next. Prescott is still 2 days' ride from here, and you have no supplies, no wagon, and no money." The reality of her situation crashed down on Nora like a cold wave. "I do not know what to do," she admitted. "I have nothing." James was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "Chloride is about 6 hours' ride north. It is not much of a town, maybe 300 people, but there is a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Chen. She is fair and honest. I could take you there, and maybe you could work for room and board while you figure out your next step." "I could not ask you to take me all that way," Nora protested. "You have already done so much. You are not asking. I am offering." James walked to his horse and began adjusting the saddle. "I cannot leave you here alone, and Chloride is closer than Prescott. Once you are settled and have saved some money, you can continue on to your brother if you want, or you might decide to stay. Like I said, it is rough, but there are good people there too." Nora looked around at the destroyed wagon, at the empty desert stretching in every direction, and realized she had no other choice. "I accept your kind offer, James. Thank you." He nodded and led his horse over to her. "Have you ridden before?" "A few times, but not recently." "We will share my horse. It is a long ride, but he can handle both of us if we take it slow." James mounted first, then reached down to help Nora up. She placed her foot in the stirrup and let him pull her up behind him. It felt strange and intimate to sit so close to a man she had just met, her arms wrapped around his waist to keep from falling, but she reminded herself that he was helping her and she needed to trust someone. "Hold on tight," James said. "We will stop at the creek about 2 hours from here to rest and water the horse." They rode north, leaving the smoking ruins of Nora's wagon behind. The Arizona landscape stretched out before them, all red rock and scrub brush and endless blue sky. The sun beat down without mercy, and Nora was grateful for the wide brim of James's hat, which provided some shade. As they rode, James talked about Chloride, describing the town so she would know what to expect. It had started as a silver mining camp about 5 years earlier, he explained, when prospectors found rich deposits in the nearby mountains. Now it had a main street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church, and the boarding house. Most of the men worked in the mines or raised cattle on the surrounding ranches. "What do you do?" Nora asked, her voice raised to be heard over the horses' hooves. "Bit of everything," James said. "I have a small piece of land outside town where I raise horses and train them for ranchers and miners. I also do repairs and odd jobs when needed. It keeps me fed and gives me purpose." "You have family in Chloride." "No family anywhere anymore. My parents died in a house fire when I was 17. My sister married and moved to California 3 years ago. I get letters from her sometimes." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Nora heard the loneliness underneath. "What about you? Just your brother?" "Yes. My mother died from pneumonia 2 winters ago. I took care of her at the end, and after she passed, I lived with a cousin until her husband made it clear I was not welcome. That is when I wrote to my brother about coming west." Nora rested her cheek against James's back, suddenly exhausted. "I thought this would be a new beginning. Now I am not sure what it is." "Maybe it still is," James said quietly. "Just not the beginning you expected." They rode in comfortable silence after that, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait almost lulling Nora to sleep despite the heat and discomfort. She found herself noticing details about James. The way he sat straight in the saddle, the confident way he handled the reins, the fact that he smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something else she could not quite name but found pleasant. When they reached the creek, James helped her down and she went to wash her face and hands while he tended to the horse. The water was cool and clear, and she drank deeply, then tried to clean some of the soot from her dress, though it was a lost cause. She would need new clothes, but she had no money to buy them. "Mrs. Chen might have something you could borrow until you earn enough for new things," James said, as if reading her mind. He sat down in the shade of a cottonwood tree and gestured for her to join him. "She is a good woman. Came here from San Francisco about 3 years ago after her husband died in the mines. She turned their house into a boarding house and has made it work despite all the rough characters around." Nora sat beside him, keeping a respectful distance. "You speak highly of her." "She gave me a place to stay when I first came to Chloride with nothing but my horse and my tools. Never asked questions, never judged, just offered me a room and fair terms." He pulled some jerky from his saddlebag and offered her a piece. "She has a daughter too, about your age I would guess. Sarah. She helps run the boarding house and takes care of the books." They ate in silence, the jerky tough but satisfying. Nora realized she had not eaten since the previous afternoon, before the raiders came. Her stomach growled embarrassingly loud, and James pulled out more jerky without comment. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said after a while. "Of course." "Why did you stop to help me? You said most men would ride past, but you did not." "Why?" James was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the creek. "My sister was traveling alone when her husband to be found her broken down on the side of the road. He helped her fix her wagon wheel and ended up riding with her all the way to the next town to make sure she arrived safely. She said if he had not stopped, she probably would have died out there." He looked at Nora. "I guess I figured if someone helped my sister when she needed it, I should do the same for someone else. Your sister sounds like she married a good man." "She did. He is a doctor in Sacramento now. They have 2 children. James stood and brushed off his pants. "We should keep moving. The sooner we get to Chloride, the sooner you can rest properly." They rode through the afternoon, the sun gradually sinking toward the western horizon. Nora's body ached from the unfamiliar position, her legs cramping and her back sore, but she did not complain. James was doing her an enormous favor, and she would not repay him with whining. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, just as James had described, Nora saw buildings appear in the distance. Chloride was built against the side of a mountain, The houses and businesses clustered along a single main street with smaller buildings scattered up the hillside. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could hear the distant sound of a piano playing. "That is the saloon," James said. "The owners are a couple from Missouri, the Harrises. They run a relatively clean establishment, no gambling fights if they can help it. The piano player is a man named Walter who claims he played in San Francisco before coming here." They rode down the main street as the last light faded from the sky. A few men stood outside the saloon smoking, and they nodded to James as he passed. Women in simple dresses hurried along the wooden sidewalks, heading home before full dark. Dogs barked from somewhere behind the buildings. James stopped his horse in front of a two-story house painted white with green shutters. A sign hanging from the porch read, "Chen's Boarding House Clean Rooms Fair Rates." Light glowed from several windows, and Nora could smell something cooking that made her mouth water. "This is it," James said, dismounting. He helped Nora down, and she stood on shaky legs, holding onto the horse for support until feeling returned to her limbs. The front door opened and a small Chinese woman stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. When she saw James, she smiled. "Mr. Quinn, welcome back. We were not expecting you today." Her English was accented but clear. "Hello, Mrs. Chen. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I have a situation that requires your help." James gestured to Nora. "This is Miss Nora Ellison. She was attacked by raiders last night and lost everything. I was hoping you might have a room available and possibly some work she could do in exchange. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted to concern as she looked at Nora, taking in the soot-stained dress and exhausted face. "Of course. Please come inside, both of you." She held the door open. "You look ready to collapse, Miss Ellison. When did you last eat a proper meal?" "Yesterday afternoon," Nora admitted. "Then we will fix that immediately. Come." Mrs. Chen led them through a clean, simply furnished parlor into a dining room where several men sat eating dinner. The smell of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the air, and Nora's stomach clenched with hunger. "Sarah," Mrs. Chen called toward the kitchen, "we have guests who need feeding." A young woman emerged from the kitchen, tall and slender with her mother's dark hair and eyes but features that suggested a mixed heritage. She carried a tray of biscuits that she set on the table before turning to greet them. "Sarah, this is Miss Nora Ellison, and you know Mr. Quinn. Miss Ellison will be staying with us." Mrs. Chen pulled out a chair. "Please sit, both of you. Sarah will bring food." Nora sank into the chair gratefully, and James sat beside her. Sarah disappeared back into the kitchen and returned moments later with plates piled with chicken, roasted potatoes, and green beans. Nora tried to eat slowly and maintain her manners, but the food was delicious and she was starving. While they ate, James quietly explained to Mrs. Chen what had happened. The older woman listened with a sympathetic expression, occasionally shaking her head. "You are fortunate Mr. Quinn found you," Mrs. Chen said when he finished. "The desert is no place for a woman alone." "I know that now," Nora said quietly. "As for work, I can certainly use help. Sarah and I manage everything ourselves, but another pair of hands would make life easier. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending. Can you do these things?" "Yes, madam. My mother taught me well." "Good. Room and board in exchange for work, and we will see about wages once you are settled. Does that sound fair?" "More than fair. Thank you so much, Mrs. Chen." Nora felt tears prick her eyes again. "I do not know how I will ever repay everyone's kindness." "Pay it forward someday, Mrs. Chen said simply. "That is all any of us can do." She stood. "Sarah will show you to your room. There is water for washing, and I believe we can find you a clean dress for tomorrow. Tonight you need rest." Nora stood, her legs still wobbly. She turned to James, who was finishing his meal. "Thank you for everything. For finding my photograph, for bringing me here safely. I will never forget your kindness." James stood and tipped his hat. "You are welcome, Nora. I am glad I could help." He turned to Mrs. Chen. "I will head home now. Thank you for the meal." "You are always welcome here, Mr. Quinn," Mrs. Chen said warmly. Nora watched James leave, feeling strangely bereft. He had been her only constant through a terrible ordeal, and now he was walking away. She reminded herself that he had his own life, his own responsibilities. He had already done more than anyone could expect. Sarah touched her arm gently. "Come, I will show you where you will sleep." Nora followed Sarah up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The boarding house was clean and well-maintained, with simple but comfortable furnishings. Sarah led her to a small room at the end of the hall that contained a narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a single window looking out toward the mountains. "It is not much, but it is private and quiet," Sarah said. "The water basin is full, and I will bring you a nightgown and a dress for tomorrow. They might be a bit long since you are shorter than me, but we can hem them later." "This is perfect. Thank you, Sarah." Nora sat on the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable. The events of the past day and a half were catching up with her, and she could barely keep her eyes open. Sarah brought the promised nightgown and dress, along with a hairbrush and some soap. "The privy is out back, and there is a washroom on the first floor if you want a proper bath tomorrow. Mother usually starts breakfast at 6, but you should sleep as long as you need. You have been through something terrible." After Sarah left, Nora undressed and washed as best she could with the basin water. She carefully unwrapped the photograph from her bodice and studied it in the lamplight. Despite everything, it had survived. Her parents smiled up at her from another time, another life. She kissed the photograph gently and tucked it into the top drawer of the chest, then pulled on the nightgown and crawled into bed. She expected to fall asleep immediately, but instead found herself thinking about James Quinn. The way he had helped her without hesitation, the gentleness in his calloused hands as they searched through the ashes, the patient way he had answered her questions during the long ride. She wondered if she would see him again, or if he would simply fade back into his own life now that his good deed was done. Eventually, exhaustion won and she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Nora woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from downstairs. For a moment, she forgot where she was, then memory returned in a rush. The raiders, the fire, James, chloride. She sat up and saw that someone had left a pitcher of fresh water on the washstand, and the dress Sarah had promised was draped over a chair. She washed and dressed quickly, grateful that the simple blue cotton dress fit reasonably well despite being a bit long. Her own ruined dress lay in a heap on the floor, and she folded it carefully, thinking she might be able to salvage some of the fabric for patches or rags. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Chen and Sarah in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the boarders. The older woman looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Miss Ellison. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks, thank you." Nora looked around. "What can I do to help?" "You can start by eating breakfast yourself. Then Sarah will show you how we do things around here." Mrs. Chen handed her a plate. "We feed boarders at 6 and again at 6 in the evening. Between those times, there is always cleaning, laundry, and preparation for the next meal." Nora ate quickly, then spent the rest of the morning learning the routines of the boarding house. There were currently 8 men living there, all miners or ranch hands who worked long days and came back tired and hungry. The work was hard but straightforward, and Nora found comfort in the familiar tasks of cooking and cleaning. Sarah proved to be a kind and patient teacher, showing Nora where everything was kept and explaining her mother's preferences. As they worked together hanging laundry in the backyard, Sarah said, "Mr. Quinn is a good man. He has helped our family many times." "He certainly helped me," Nora agreed, pinning a sheet to the line. "Does he come to town often?" "A few times a week, usually. He brings horses to sell or trade, picks up supplies, sometimes has dinner here." Sarah smiled. All the unmarried women in Chloride have tried to catch his attention at one time or another, but he keeps to himself mostly. Nora felt her cheeks warm and was glad Sarah was not looking at her. "I suppose he is married to his work." "Maybe. Or maybe he just has not met the right person yet." Sarah picked up the empty laundry basket. "Come on, we need to start preparing lunch." The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Nora worked from dawn until evening, but the work felt purposeful, and Mrs. Chen was a fair employer who made sure she had time to rest. The boarders were respectful, and the other townspeople she met were friendly enough, though curious about the newcomer. A week passed without any sign of James, and Nora told herself she was being foolish to think about him so much. He had helped her because he was a decent man, nothing more. She needed to focus on her new life in Chloride and stop wondering when she might see him again. Then one afternoon, as she was sweeping the front porch, she heard the sound of hooves and looked up to see James riding down the main street leading two beautiful horses behind him. Her heart jumped in a way that surprised her. He saw her and smiled, tipping his hat. "Hello, Nora. How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you." She set the broom aside, suddenly conscious of her flour-dusted apron and wind-blown hair. "Mrs. Chen and Sarah have been wonderful." James dismounted and tied his horses to the rail. "I am glad to hear it. I was going to stop by after I finish my business at the stable, but since you are here, I wanted to make sure you were doing all right." "I am, truly. Thanks to you." Nora hesitated, then added, "Would you like to come in for coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "I would like that very much." She led him inside and poured 2 cups of coffee in the empty dining room. They sat at the table, and Nora found herself relaxing in his presence in a way she had not expected. "How is the horse training going?" she asked. "Good. Those 2 outside are sold to a rancher north of here. He is paying well, so I can afford to buy some better stock for breeding." James sipped his coffee. "How do you like Chloride so far?" "It is different from what I am used to, but I like it. The work is honest and people have been kind." She smiled. "I even received a letter from my brother yesterday. I wrote to him explaining what happened, and he sent money for a stage ticket to Prescott, but I think I might stay here for a while longer." "That is good news. About the letter and the staying." James set down his cup. "Nora, I was wondering if you might allow me to take you to dinner sometime." "Not here, but at the restaurant across from the general store. They serve a decent meal, and it would give us a chance to talk without you having to work." Nora's heart raced. "Are you asking to court me, James Quinn?" "I suppose I am, if you would be amenable to the idea." He looked almost nervous, which she found endearing. "I know we have not known each other long, but I find myself thinking about you often. I would like to know you better." "I would like that too," Nora said softly. "Very much." His face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious expression. "Tomorrow evening, then. I could come by around 7. That would be perfect." After James left, Nora found herself humming as she returned to her chores. Sarah noticed and raised an eyebrow but said nothing, though her knowing smile spoke volumes. That evening, as Nora lay in bed, she took out her parents' photograph and studied it in the lamplight. "I think you would like him," she whispered to their frozen smiles. "He is kind and honest and strong. He helped me when I had nothing." She traced her mother's face with one finger. "I know it is too soon to be having these feelings, but I cannot seem to help it." The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Nora tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. Sarah helped her choose which dress to wear, lending her a lovely green one that brought out the color of Nora's eyes, and even Mrs. Chen seemed pleased by the development. "Mr. Quinn is a good man," the older woman said as she helped Nora fix her hair. "Steady and reliable. Those are rare qualities in this place." When James arrived at 7 precisely, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed, Nora felt her breath catch. He offered his arm and escorted her across the street to the restaurant, which was called simply the dining room, and run by a couple named the Mitchells. They were seated at a corner table with a red checkered tablecloth and a small oil lamp. The menu was limited, but the food was good, and Nora found conversation flowing easily between them. James told her about his life in Kansas, about working cattle drives and learning to break horses from an old cowboy named Red who had taken him under his wing. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her mother's sewing circle and her father's workshop, about the books she loved to read and her dream of teaching. "You could still teach," James said. "The school here is small, but they are always looking for help. The teacher, Miss Porter, is getting married next month and moving to Tucson. They will need someone to take her place." "Do you really think they would hire me?" Nora asked, excitement building. "I think you should talk to the school board. I know one of the members, Mr. Harrison. He runs the general store. I could introduce you." "I would appreciate that so much." After dinner, James walked her back to the boarding house slowly, neither of them in a hurry to end the evening. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds on velvet. "Thank you for tonight," Nora said when they reached the porch. "I had a wonderful time, so did I." James took her hand gently. "May I see you again? Perhaps we could go riding on Sunday after church. I would like to show you some of the beautiful places around here." "I would love that." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it softly, then released it and stepped back. "Good night, Nora." "Good night, James." She watched him walk away into the darkness, her hand tingling where his lips had touched it, her heart fuller than it had been since before her mother died. Over the following weeks, James became a regular fixture in Nora's life. They had dinner together twice a week, went riding on Sundays, and talked whenever he came to town on business. True to his word, he introduced her to Mr. Harrison, who was impressed enough to bring her before the school board. After a brief interview and a demonstration of her teaching abilities, they offered her the position starting in the fall. Nora felt like her life was finally coming together. She had meaningful work, good friends, and a man she was growing to care for deeply. The memory of the burning wagon and those terrifying hours in the darkness began to fade, replaced by new, better memories. One Sunday afternoon, James took her to a spot in the mountains where a small waterfall created a pool of clear water surrounded by cottonwood trees. They sat on the rocks and ate the lunch Nora had packed, talking about everything and nothing. "Can I tell you something?" James said, skipping a stone across the water. "Of course. When I found you that day, kneeling in the ashes of your wagon, I thought you were the bravest person I had ever seen." He turned to look at her. "You had lost everything, but all you cared about was that photograph. Not the money or the supplies or even the wagon itself, just that picture of your parents. It made me realize what really matters in life." "What do you think matters?" Nora asked softly. "The people we love, the memories we make, the connections that last beyond death." He reached for her hand. "I have been alone for a long time, Nora, by choice mostly. After my parents died and my sister left, I told myself I was better off that way. Then I met you, and suddenly being alone does not seem appealing anymore." Nora's eyes filled with tears. "I feel the same way. After my mother died, I felt so lost. My cousin made it clear I was a burden, and my brother was too far away to help. I thought going west would give me a fresh start, but I was really just running away from my loneliness." She squeezed his hand. "Then you found me, helped me, and showed me kindness when I needed it most. You gave me more than my photograph, James. You gave me hope." He pulled her close and kissed her gently, his lips warm and soft against hers. Nora melted into the kiss, her arms wrapping around his neck, feeling like she had finally found where she belonged. When they pulled apart, James rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you, Nora Ellison. I am falling in love with you too, James Quinn." They sat by the waterfall until the sun began to set, talking about their future in careful, hopeful terms. James spoke about expanding his horse breeding operation, maybe buying more land. Nora talked about the school and the students she would teach. Neither of them said the words marriage or forever, but those concepts hung in the air between them, sweet and promising. As summer deepened into its hottest months, their relationship deepened too. James began spending more time in town, often having dinner at the boarding house, and staying late into the evening talking with Nora on the porch. Mrs. Chen and Sarah watched with approving smiles, and even the boarders began teasing them good-naturedly about wedding bells. One evening in late August, James asked Nora to go for a walk. They strolled down the quiet main street as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. He led her to the small church at the end of town, and they sat on the steps, looking out at the mountains. "Nora, I need to ask you something important," James said, his voice serious. Her heart began to race. "What is it? I know we have only known each other for a few months. I know some people would say that is not long enough to make a lifetime decision." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to build a life with you, raise a family with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me?" Nora felt tears stream down her face as joy exploded in her chest. "Yes. Yes, of course I will marry you." James pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. "It was my mother's. The only thing I saved from the fire. I know it is not fancy, but—" "It is perfect," Nora whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. They kissed on the church steps as the last light faded from the sky, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. When they finally pulled apart, James said, "I want to do this properly. I want to talk to your brother, get his blessing. And we should take our time planning the wedding, make sure everything is how you want it." "I do not need anything fancy," Nora said. "I just need you. Even so, I want to do this right. You deserve that." They told Mrs. Chen and Sarah that evening, and the boarding house erupted in celebration. The boarders broke out a bottle of whiskey they had been saving for a special occasion, and everyone toasted the happy couple. Sarah hugged Nora tightly, whispering, "I am so happy for you. You deserve all the joy in the world." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. James wrote to Nora's brother in Prescott, and received a warm letter back giving his blessing and promising to attend the wedding. They set the date for late October, after the worst of the summer heat had passed, but before winter set in. Nora began teaching at the school in September, and discovered she loved working with the children even more than she had imagined. James started building an addition onto his small house, creating a proper bedroom and a kitchen that would accommodate a family. The whole town seemed invested in their happiness. The ladies of Chloride helped Nora sew her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation in cream-colored silk that Sarah had found in a shop in Prescott. The men helped James finish the addition to his house, working together to raise the walls and put on the roof. Even the saloon owners, the Harrises, offered to host the wedding reception. Through it all, Nora kept her parents' photograph on the bedside table in her room at the boarding house. She would look at it every night before sleeping and every morning when she woke, feeling their presence and approval. Sometimes she would talk to them, telling them about James and how happy she was, how she wished they could be there for the wedding. "But in a way you will be," she whispered one night, holding the photograph close. "You brought me to this moment. If the wagon had not burned, if James had not helped me find this picture, I might never have stayed in Chloride. I might never have met him. Everything that happened, as terrible as it was, led me to exactly where I am supposed to be." The night before the wedding, Sarah helped Nora pack her belongings. It was strange to think she would no longer live at the boarding house, though Mrs. Chen had made her promise to visit often. "I am going to miss you," Sarah said, folding Nora's dresses carefully. "The house will feel empty without you." "I will only be a few miles away," Nora reminded her. "And you must come visit all the time. You are like a sister to me now. You are like a sister to me too." Sarah paused, then added quietly, "Do you ever think about that night, when the raiders burned your wagon, sometimes, but not with fear anymore, not even with anger, really?" Nora wrapped her mother's photograph in fresh cloth, preparing to take it to her new home. "I think about how it brought James and me together, how something so terrible led to something so beautiful. It makes me believe that even in our darkest moments, there can be purpose we do not yet understand." "That is a good way to look at it," Sarah agreed. The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon, with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Nora's brother Thomas arrived the day before, a tall young man with kind eyes who hugged his sister tightly and told her how proud their parents would be. He walked her down the aisle of the small church while the whole town watched. James stood at the altar in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Nora's face as she approached. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, conducted by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. When James said, "I do," his voice was strong and sure. When Nora said the same, tears streamed down her face. They kissed as husband and wife to applause and cheers, then walked out into the sunshine to begin their new life together. The reception at the saloon was a joyful affair with music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Nora danced with James, with her brother, with Mr. Harrison and the other men who had welcomed her to Chloride. She laughed more than she had in years, feeling truly happy for the first time since her mother's death. As the sun set and the party continued, James pulled Nora aside. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Quinn?" Hearing her new name made Nora's heart soar. "Yes, I am ready." They said their goodbyes and climbed into James's wagon, which several of the men had decorated with ribbons and tin cans that rattled as they drove. The ride to James's property took about 20 minutes, and when they arrived, Nora saw that someone had lit lanterns around the house, creating a warm glow of welcome. James carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, then set her down gently in the main room. He had worked hard to make the house comfortable, with furniture he had built himself and curtains that Mrs. Chen had sewn. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and fresh flowers sat in a vase on the table. "Welcome home," James said softly. Nora looked around at her new life, at the man she loved, at the future stretching out before them full of possibility. "I am home," she agreed. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, two lonely people finally finding solace in each other's arms. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, James tracing patterns on Nora's shoulder while she rested her head on his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For stopping that day. For helping me search through the ashes. for caring about a stranger's lost photograph. She lifted her head to look at him, for giving me a reason to stay. James kissed her forehead. Thank you for trusting me, for choosing me, for making me believe in family again. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, two souls who had found each other in the vast Arizona desert and chosen to build something beautiful together. The first year of their marriage was filled with hard work and simple joys. Nora taught at the school Monday through Friday, her students growing to love her patient teaching methods and warm smile. James continued training horses, and his reputation grew to the point where ranchers from as far as Prescott and Kingman sought him out. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, talking about their days and making plans for the future. They visited the boarding house often, having dinner with Mrs. Chen and Sarah at least once a week. Thomas wrote regularly from Prescott, and Nora wrote back with long letters describing her new life. She had never been happier. In the spring, Nora discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening after dinner, placing his hand on her still flat stomach and watching his face transform with wonder and joy. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Nora asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. Happy does not begin to cover it. He pulled her into his arms. "A family. Our own family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Nora continued teaching until late summer when her growing belly made it too difficult to stand for long periods. Sarah would visit often, helping with household tasks and keeping Nora company. Mrs. Chen arrived one day with a beautiful quilt she had sewn for the baby, each patch a different pattern in soft blues and yellows. "You do not know if it is a boy or girl yet," she said, spreading the quilt across the cradle James had built. "So I made it something either would like." "It is beautiful," Nora said, tears in her eyes. Pregnancy had made her emotional, crying at the smallest kindnesses. "Thank you so much." James hovered anxiously as Nora's due date approached, barely wanting to leave her side. When her labor began one October evening, exactly a year after their wedding, he rode to town at breakneck speed to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in chloride. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. James paced outside the bedroom, listening to Nora's cries and feeling helpless. Finally, just as the sun cleared the horizon, he heard a new sound. The thin, piercing wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the bedroom, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Quinn, and your wife is doing well." James rushed into the room to find Nora propped up against the pillows, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in Mrs. Chen's quilt. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "James, meet your son." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. The child was small and red-faced, with a tuft of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. Something in James's chest cracked open at the sight, a love so fierce and immediate that it took his breath away. "He is perfect," James whispered. "You are perfect." He kissed Nora's forehead gently. "What should we name him?" Nora had been thinking about this for months. "I would like to name him William, after my father, if that is acceptable to you. William Quinn. It is a strong name, I like it." James touched the baby's tiny hand, and William's fingers immediately curled around his father's finger with surprising strength. "Hello, William. Welcome to the world." They spent the rest of the day marveling at their son, taking turns holding him and trying to understand that this tiny person was theirs, that they had created him together. When Mrs. Patterson finally left and they were alone as a family for the first time, Nora said, "Can you bring me the photograph?" "From the bedroom." James retrieved her parents' photograph and handed it to her. Nora held it next to William so she could see both at once. "This is your grandson," she told the frozen images of her parents. "His name is William, after his grandfather. I wish you could meet him, hold him, watch him grow. But I will tell him all about you. He will know where he came from and the good people who made our family what it is." James sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and together they looked at 3 generations, past, present, and future, all connected by blood and love. The years that followed were busy and full. William grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses almost as much as his father did. Nora returned to teaching when he was old enough for school, bringing him with her to the classroom where he learned his letters alongside the other children. James's horse breeding business continued to thrive, and they were able to buy more land and build a larger barn. When William was 4, Nora became pregnant again. This time she had an easier labor, and their daughter was born on a warm spring morning. They named her Charlotte after James's mother, and she had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. Sarah married a rancher named Michael when William was 5, and Nora stood up with her at the wedding, grateful to see her friend so happy. Mrs. Chen continued running the boarding house with the help of a young woman she had hired, and she doted on Nora's children like they were her own grandchildren. Thomas visited from Prescott whenever he could, and eventually he married as well, a teacher named Elizabeth who reminded Nora a bit of their mother. When they had their first child, a daughter named Caroline, Nora traveled to Prescott to meet her new niece and found herself crying happy tears as she held the baby. "Our parents would have loved this," Thomas said, watching his sister with his daughter. "All of us together raising our children, carrying on the family." "They do love it," Nora said firmly. "They are watching over us, I know they are." Life in Chloride continued to evolve. The mines eventually played out, and some families moved on to other opportunities, but enough people stayed to keep the town alive. New businesses opened, the school expanded, and a proper church was built to replace the small chapel. James became a respected member of the community, known for his honesty and skill. Nora was beloved by generations of students who remembered her patient teaching and kind heart. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Nora with a trip to Tucson, arranging for Mrs. Chen to watch the children for a week. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, and walked through the bustling streets like newlyweds. On their last evening there, James bought Nora a beautiful silver locket. "For you," he said, clasping it around her neck. "So you can carry the people you love close to your heart." Nora opened the locket and found that James had already placed 2 tiny photographs inside, one of William and one of Charlotte. "It is perfect, thank you," she kissed him softly. "These 10 years have been the happiest of my life." "Mine too," James agreed, "and we have many more ahead of us." When William was 12, he began working with his father, learning to train horses with the same patient skill James had learned from Red all those years ago. Charlotte was quieter than her brother, preferring books to horses, and Nora spent many evenings reading with her daughter, sharing her love of stories and learning. Then, when Nora was 38 and thought her family was complete, she discovered she was pregnant again. The pregnancy was more difficult than the others, leaving her tired and often ill. James worried constantly, but Nora assured him she was fine, that some pregnancies were just harder than others. Their 3rd child, another son, was born in late winter after a labor that frightened James badly. But both mother and baby came through healthy, and they named him Samuel, simply because they both liked the name. Samuel was a quiet baby who rarely cried, watching the world with solemn, dark eyes that seemed to see everything. The Quinn family was complete. James and Nora, William, Charlotte, and Samuel. They lived in their house outside Chloride, raising horses and children, teaching school and being part of a community. It was not the life Nora had imagined when she left St. Louis so many years ago, but it was infinitely better. On a spring afternoon when Nora was 43, she sat on the porch watching James teach Samuel, now 5 years old, how to handle a rope. William was working with a young mare in the corral, and Charlotte was inside practicing her piano lessons on the instrument James had bought her for her 13th birthday. The Arizona sun was warm but not hot, and wildflowers bloomed across the desert in a riot of color. Sarah rode up on horseback, her own 3 children trailing behind on their ponies. "Hello, Nora. We thought we would visit and see if the children want to play. They would love that." Nora called to her family, and soon all the children were running around the yard, their laughter filling the air while the adults sat on the porch with cold lemonade. "You remember when we first met?" Sarah asked, watching the children play. "You were so lost and frightened, covered in soot from your burned wagon." "I remember," Nora said softly. "I thought my life was over. I had nothing except a photograph and the clothes on my back. And now look at you. A home, a family, a career. You have built something beautiful." "We all have," Nora corrected. "You and your family, Mrs. Chen, Thomas and Elizabeth in Prescott. We have all built good lives out here." James came up to the porch and sat beside Nora, slipping his arm around her waist in the easy, comfortable way of long married couples. "What are you ladies talking about?" "The past," Nora said. "And how grateful I am for it, even the hard parts." That night, after Sarah and her family had gone home and the children were asleep, Nora took out her parents' photograph. The edges were more worn now, the image slightly faded, but the faces were still clear. She had kept it safe all these years, looking at it whenever she needed to remember where she came from. "I have a good life," she told her parents' images. "A husband who loves me, children who make me proud, work that matters. I know you would be happy for me." She traced her mother's face gently. "Sometimes I still miss you so much it hurts, but then I look at my children and I see pieces of you in them. Charlotte has mother's patience. William has father's steady hands. Samuel has both your kindnesses." She placed the photograph back in its special box, then went to the bedroom where James was already in bed, reading by lamplight. He looked up when she entered and smiled, and Nora's heart swelled with love for this man who had helped her search through ashes all those years ago, who had cared about a stranger's loss, who had become her partner and her family. "Come to bed," James said, setting his book aside. "You look tired." Nora climbed in beside him, fitting herself against his side like she had done thousands of times before. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am." "We are both lucky," James corrected. He kissed the top of her head. "That day I found you in the desert was the best day of my life." "Everything good that has happened since started from that moment." "I love you," Nora whispered. "I love you too. Always." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, just as they had on their wedding night and every night since. The years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of family life. William grew into a fine young man and took over more of the horse training business as James's hair turned gray. Charlotte finished school and became a teacher herself, taking a position in Prescott near her Uncle Thomas. Samuel showed an aptitude for working with numbers and talked about becoming a banker or accountant. Nora continued teaching until she was 50, when she finally retired to spend more time with her growing number of grandchildren. William had married a rancher's daughter named Anna, and they had 2 children. Charlotte married a lawyer named Peter, and they had 3. Even young Samuel eventually married a girl named Rebecca from Phoenix, and they settled in Chloride to raise their family. James and Nora grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated their 25th anniversary, then their 30th, then their 40th. Their hair turned white and their steps slowed, but they still sat on the porch every evening, watching the sunset and talking about their day. On their 45th anniversary, James gave Nora a gift, a beautifully crafted wooden frame for her parents' photograph. He had carved their names and dates into the wood with painstaking care. "So they will always be remembered," he said, as Nora cried happy tears. "And so our grandchildren will know where they came from." The photograph went on the mantel in the main room, where everyone who visited could see it. Nora would tell the grandchildren stories about their great-grandparents, about the carpenter and the seamstress who loved each other so much, about how she had carried their memory across the desert and into her new life. When Nora was 68, she became ill with pneumonia. The same illness that had taken her mother settled into her lungs, and despite the doctor's best efforts, she grew weaker. James stayed by her bedside day and night, holding her hand and telling her stories of their life together. "You remember that day?" he would ask. "When we went to the waterfall and I told you I was falling in love with you." "I remember everything," Nora would whisper. "Every day with you was a gift." Their children and grandchildren gathered around her bed, tears streaming down their faces. Nora looked at each of them in turn, blessing them with her fading strength. But in the end, it was just her and James, the way it had been from the beginning. He lay beside her on the bed, holding her close. "I am not afraid," Nora whispered. "I will see my parents again. I will tell them all about you, about our children, about the beautiful life we built." "I will be along soon enough," James said, his voice breaking. "Wait for me." "Always," Nora promised. She took one last breath, smiled at her husband of 47 years, and let go. James held her for a long time after she was gone, memorizing the feel of her in his arms one last time. When William finally came in to check on them, he found his father crying silently, still cradling his wife's body. They buried Nora in the Chloride Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the desert she had come to love. The whole town turned out for the funeral, testament to the impact she had made on so many lives. James stood at the graveside with her parents' photograph in his hands, and before they lowered the casket, he tucked it inside with her. "You should have this," he whispered. "You will see them soon and you can give it back to them in person." After the funeral, James returned to the empty house and tried to figure out how to live without the woman who had been his center for nearly 5 decades. His children urged him to move in with one of them, but he refused. This was the home he had built with Nora, and he would stay in it as long as he could. He lasted 2 years without her, 2 years of slowly fading. He continued working with the horses because it gave him purpose, spent time with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren because they carried pieces of Nora in them. But everyone could see that part of him had died with his wife. On a warm spring morning, William found his father sitting in his chair on the porch, looking out at the mountains. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, a slight smile on his weathered face. They buried James beside Nora under the Arizona sky they had both loved. William placed his father's worn leather gloves in the casket, the same gloves he had given Nora that first day when she searched through the ashes for her photograph. At the funeral, as the preacher spoke about love and devotion and lives well lived, Charlotte told her children the story she had heard so many times, about how their grandmother had lost everything in a fire, about how their grandfather had stopped to help a stranger in need, about how he had helped her search through the wagon ashes until they found the one photograph she needed, about how that act of kindness had led to a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. "Remember this," Charlotte told them, tears streaming down her face. Love is worth searching for, worth fighting for, worth every moment of joy and pain. Your grandparents showed us that. They built something beautiful from ashes and loss, and we are all here because they chose love. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren listened, committing the story to memory so they could tell it to their own children someday. The story of the cowboy and the woman with the photograph, and how they found each other in the Arizona desert and built a legacy of love that would last for generations. Years later, when the town of Chloride celebrated its centennial, someone suggested creating a memorial to the founding families who had built the community. At the top of the list were James and Nora Quinn, the horse trainer and the teacher who had raised 3 children, taught countless students, and lived their lives with integrity and love. A small plaque was placed in the town square with their names and dates, along with a brief inscription. They showed us that from loss can come love, and from love comes everything that matters. And in homes across Arizona, in Chloride and Prescott and Phoenix and beyond, the descendants of James and Nora Quinn kept their story alive, telling their children about the photograph that survived a fire, about the cowboy who helped search through the ashes, about the love that bloomed in the desert and lasted beyond death itself. The photograph had been buried with Nora, returned to her parents as James had intended. But the story it represented lived on, proof that sometimes the things we think we have lost forever are simply waiting to lead us exactly where we need to be, into the arms of the people we are meant to love, in the places we are meant to call home. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever lies beyond this life, James and Nora walked together again under endless skies, hand in hand with the parents who had brought them to that moment, all of them together at last, bound by love that transcends time and death and the ashes of what was, celebrating instead the beauty of what is and what will always be. The end.